This is Midlife Virus with your host, Sean Harflinger, and we are going to be talking about what it is to be a father, the story you tell, and how that narrative drives the success of your family. We're going to be talking about what it is to be a father over a couple of episodes, and we're going to start with my personal story so you can understand my frame of reference. Thank you for joining Midlife Virus. Let's get started. Warning, adult content. Cover your ears, cover your children's ears, cover your dog's ears. My grandfather broke my father, and my father broke me. And here we lead up to Father's Day with this Midlife Virus Father's Day series. And we're going to talk about all kinds of important things that fathers need to hear, that mothers need to hear, that families need to hear. And the reason is important because not all families are the same. Not every family has the same narrative, the same definitions, the same agenda, right? My own personal experience is far from others, and it might be similar. But this story needs to be told because there is an important lesson in this journey, and it starts with the stories that you are told. So I'm going to get right into it. Okay, so here we go. I come from a very weird, jaded past, a weird story where from the very beginning of my life, there is this narrative of criminality. There are family members in prison. There is violence. There's crimes going on. There's, don't talk to the guys who knock on the door. It's a weird thing. There's prostitution, pet lions, hitmen. It goes on and on and on. And so to unpack it, as a child, you just don't do it, right? As a child, you just go with the flow and listen to it and try to define it and figure out what these things are and how do you fit in the picture as a third generation man, even though I'm much, much farther down the generational line from the beginning of time. But here I am in my immediate time frame. It's myself, my father, and my grandfather. And so for most of us, that is the generational narrative that you've got. And so you've got this generational narrative. Some people's generational narrative speaks of war heroes or neuroscientists or astronauts or the most caring lady on the block. And so that frame of reference really starts to build your personal narrative of yourself and what you are and creates all kinds of wonderful maps so you can go forward in the world and kind of, per culture and society, know your place in the race. And so the disadvantage for many people in the world is the stories that their parents tell, and their parents don't know. You can't blame the parents. Now, side note, boop, boop, this is an observational moment. Midlife Virus is a discussion about midlife. I'm 49. So all of these discussions about my childhood and the trauma within and the weird ass stories that you grow up with, these are all observational because I've already been on the other end of this. Okay, I've already been on the other end, and the other end looks like this. Surviving suicide attempts. The other end looks like this. Waking up from violent blackouts. The other end looks like this. Binge drinking your pain away, right? So I've already been there. So these moments now are observational moments of wisdom from the middle of my life and we're going to speak to them, because not everybody, this is also something that you learn in the middle of your life after being around, not everybody has these stories. There's a lot of people who have crazy ass family stories, but there's a lot of people that live wonderfully harmonious and loving, endearing family lives, and it's amazing. My wife happens to be one of those people. Her family is large, loving, caring, supportive. Blows my mind because I didn't witness a similarity growing up. And so when we speak about the stories that we tell, let's get into the juice of this. Let's get into the juice, because from the get-go, here's what defines me. My grandfather is in prison. And when you hear the story of why your grandfather is in prison, it's because he's a violent man. He's been in and out of prison a half a dozen times. And every time he gets out of prison, he marries a new woman. And so the story of my life is my grandfather is a violent man, incredibly violent, in and out of prison with several wives, and now I have all these half uncles and these half aunties. And so I have this family out there in the ether that was spawned by an incredibly evil man. So this is the story, okay? And this is what you're fed. This is why, as a society, we all kind of, side eye and look at each other when whack-ass stories are told to children, because there are effects, because you've got to unwrap all this stuff. And in my case, I've got a special scenario on why I'm unwrapping it once again. But here we are. We've got this violent grandfather in the shadows, and by all accounts, he's mean, okay? You hear this through all these stories that my father has put forth. You hear this from your family. There's letters that my grandfather wrote. It took me the longest time to heap all kinds of stuff in front of my grandfather's criminal past on the internet, right? I'm a Gen X guy, right? So in the beginning, it was always cute to Google your name, and then you Google your name and, oh, hey, there's Grandpa. Yeah, well, yeah. So I've spent some time shoving stuff in front of that, and you can call that whatever that is, a trauma response, or it's just, I don't know, old school shame, which is something that you have to unpack and get used to. But Grandpa is violent. There are stories where Grandpa knocks my father out, grabs his date, and rapes her. There's stories of my grandfather beating my father, pouring gasoline on his car, and destroying the car. Now, here's the thing that boggles my mind, and we're going to have to talk about this moving forward. In this conversation, we're going to talk about epigenetic trauma. We're going to talk about heredity and mental health, because these stories that I'm sharing with you now, you're going to notice a trend moving forward, and I feel it is a vein of importance. It's a vein of gold, of silver, of platinum. It's something in the mountain that I need to pick at, because epiphany keeps leading me towards it. And it's heredity. It's mental health and heredity. But we're going to talk about that later on. It's the burdens of a father. It's something that I think all men need to speak to. If you have a history of mental health in your family, or you feel your mental health will be handed down, whether through heredity or through example, that's a thing. Make sure you speak to it like I'm speaking to it. One of my greatest gifts to my family and my children is my vulnerability and my ability to speak to my mental health. So, Grandpa's violent. He's doing terrible things to my father as a young boy. And my father, his story is anything but, nice. It's the craziest thing. I feel that my father's family has one version of him, and then the version he gave us is a different version. You know what I mean? And that's going to have to be another vein in the mountain that I pick at with a pickaxe is, you know, when you have a couple of black sheep in the family, black sheep tend to be black sheep, right? And so you don't have a lot of connection with your other family when guys like my father and my grandfather are doing the things they're doing, right? You get ostracized. Okay, so Grandpa in and out of prison, and then eventually lands in prison, and he's there to stay, and that's where Grandpa dies, is in prison, and I am 15 years old when this happens. 15 years old when this happens, and that's an interesting map building time in your life, but we're going to discuss that later on, okay? So Grandpa dies in prison, and he died in not a very spectacular fashion, but he did, and we're going to discuss this. He dies of a heart attack, but it's not the heart attack that's the interesting part. The interesting part is 6 months prior, he was firebombed in his cell and lost a leg. That right there is a true crime mystery that I need to dive into because that's newer information that I've received. Did you hear that? The little sardonic laughter just peeked out. But yeah, you know, before I knew nothing of the firebombing and the lost leg. I just knew he died in prison, and I didn't really get into the specifics of it because my father was having a meltdown, right? So it didn't work out. Didn't really know any specifics of it. What I do know is that I received his belongings from prison, and that was weird. My father didn't want them. He gave them to me by some weird rite of passage. Still to this day makes no sense. But I learned several amazing things from prison belongings. Number one, I didn't know why anybody polished up their pocket watch. Back in the day, they had these silver pocket watches. And so one of the things that was in Grandpa's belongings was a silver pocket watch. Asked my dad what that was about, and he said that's how they communicated. They would use the polished pocket watch as a mirror, talk to each other. I was like, okay, sweet. It had the craziest smell to it. The clothes, the supplies. The guy had a ton of painting supplies, which that was interesting. Boxes of painting supplies, a polished watch, trench coat that had a shotgun pocket in it, a specially made shotgun pocket. So that was another thing I found interesting was, oh, hey, you had a shotgun pocket in your trench coat. Some other items, and I remember it was goth, and in that era, in the 80s, goth had just picked up, so the shotgun trench coat worked perfectly with the combat boot combo, and so the trench coat combat boot combo worked swell for the whole 3 months that I was in my goth phase. My goth phase came and went. It actually happened because I liked a goth girl, and that never materialized into anything, you know, so yay! But anyway, the trench coat was amazing. So, smelled weird though. That's the one thing. Prison stuff smells weird. Is that the main reason why I'm not going to prison? No. Main reason why I don't want to go to prison is because it looks like generationally we've already paid those dues, and I'd be an idiot to follow that. Okay, just did you hear that? All fathers, parents, kids, all that. You are an idiot if you follow the generational curse that sends you to prison. Just get the fuck out of that. I almost did that. Bad decision. You have to unwrite that code. Okay, so Grandpa abuses the shit out of my dad. You get this letter. I'm privy to this letter that my family had. They give it to me a few years back, maybe 5-6 years ago, maybe longer. My goodness, within a decade. So I live most of my life, I am 49 now, so I'm into my early 40s. I finally get this letter written by my grandfather from prison, to which he details, and I'll have to read it on another episode, but he details the fact that his parents were good people, and it was during the Depression, and his decision to go the way he wanted was his decision. You know, for me, that was a lot of closure for me, because when you are raised the grandson, you know, of a violent, you know, murderous, thieving, whatever, you know, story was out there, and there's lots of them. When you're the grandson of that, there is this weird ownership, shame, and guilt that comes with it. When your dad is doing crappy shit to people, and he's talking about doing crappy shit to people, and your grandpa's got crappy shit going on, and he's in prison. There's examples all over the place. That is a story, that is a narrative, and it sounds terrible, but it's an observational thing. Like I said, it's already happened. The pain and the anguish of not defining it has already happened. You know what I mean? Chasing solace at the end of a bottle, that's already happened. So here we are, talking about it, going, interesting. I imagine it does similar things to similar kids. Not everybody's the same. You know what I mean? I've mentioned earlier heredity and mental health. I feel my spin on this whole thing isn't exactly as clear as I would like it, and that's because I also recognize some things going on in my mental health that are not attributed to just childhood trauma. So here's a side note real quick. We're just going to unpack this for a second. Mental health can be a lot of pieces of the stew that is within you. Stew is not just broth. Stew is all kinds of stuff. You put all kinds of stuff in stew. You put all kinds of stuff in soup. You can compound trauma a freaking million different ways. A lot of different ways. You can bring a lot of different stories into a trauma story, and it affects your brain in lots of different ways. So just remember that when you look at somebody individually, you have to look at this complete stew that is cooking in front of you, right? Super important. The reason why I say this is super important is because I happen to be one of those persons that nobody was watching. I was just on the back burner cooking, right? And if we would have had some intervention, maybe paths would have been different. I don't know. You cannot promise anything. All I know is that as a father, I took my example and made sure that I was mindful as I raised my kids. And all my kids are now adults. And throughout their childhood and puberty and teenage and young adult, and even now, you notice something, you say something, you give nourishment, you give direction, you give, a nudging, yummy, yum, hug feeling, and say, hey, it's okay. And you mentor and you tell them, I get depressed, I do stupid stuff, I make mistakes, yada, yada, yada. That's the thing that parents do. That's the thing that fathers do. Here's the thing that sucks. When you've got a story that doesn't sound like that, that's where generational problems come from, okay? So I recognize it in myself. I recognize it in others that come from a similar trauma story. And it's funny. It's not funny. It's funny that I say that it's funny. It's that gift of sardonic laughter that we got from the Holocaust and the Jewish people. They've got this gift of making terrible things funny. Anyway, here's the terrible thing about it. When you're raising your kids, there's not supposed to be a trauma story. There's supposed to be regular trauma stories. The puppy dies. They realize that the Easter Bunny isn't 6 foot tall. The Tooth Fairy, these are all American examples. Santa Claus, all this great stuff. They realize those are regular tragedies in life. You know what I mean? You're growing. Your childhood is, temporary. All those things are regular traumas. The trauma I'm talking about that changes a kid is when you realize that the contracts of trust that are supposed to be happening between a father and a son don't exist. Those are trauma memories and stuff that people takes them a minute to get over, right? Because those basic trust contracts is what builds society, right? A mother is caring, a father is protecting, a brother is loyal, a sister is soft. You know what I mean? You've got all these different things, and by no means are my definitions that I just gave as examples the only definitions. Definitions vary. It's amazing. Discussion brings forth everybody's different definitions, and so that's why it's so important. And so it totally went off on a sidebar tangent. We got to get back to the terribly mean people that were being mean to each other and all their meanness. It's actually, see, look, more sardonicism, more sardonicism. That was made up. That was completely predictable gibberish. I do a lot of predictable gibberish, just like this last 5 minutes of this segment. Anyway, back to me and my terribly sad story that I observed and lived through and hated, and I still kind of hate it, but it's okay. It's a healing journey, right? So, Grandpa, the Great Depression just, I guess, kicked Grandpa's ass, and so he's all pissed off, which is interesting when you can say generational curses and generational trauma in my family dates back to the Great Depression. That's something I think a lot of people need to think about in their own generational stories, right? My wife, they have generational stories about Pearl Harbor and Hawaii and the attack on Hawaii, right? Pretty amazing stories. But every family has this different generational story. And so my family's story from my little side family of the black sheepness, right? From the story my father tells me and my mother and some parts of my family, excuse me, is that the Great Depression comes along. Grandpa says, you know, screw that. And so he starts breaking the law, starts doing little things in and out of prison. He's marrying different people. My grandmother is the first wife he takes that we know of. And so she comes from a good family. I loved her to death. There is a missing part of the story. Somehow my precious grandmother gets turned into prostitution. So my grandfather, who was out there breaking the law left and right, doing all kinds of stuff, I don't know how and why, but my grandmother ends up becoming a prostitute. She ends up buying a lion, having a pet lion during this time. And there's a picture somewhere in my family floating around somewhere. I don't think I've ever possessed it. I can't find it if I do. But there's a picture of my grandmother and her pet lion. And my grandmother was an amazingly strong woman. By the time I enter the picture, she is married and she babysits me after school and teaches me how to spell Harflinger, which is a very long, hard name for an elementary school kid to spell. But anyway, I loved her to death. And as my dad tells me the story of my grandmother's past, I don't really understand any of it until I get older. And as you get older, you start to realize what's going on, and then you start to observe and you realize everybody's treatment. And I think one of the saddest things that I realized as I got older was how my grandmother was treated in the entirety of it. You know what I mean? She was a very powerful, pretty woman, and you know, she introduced me to all kinds of things like General Hospital, right? And she was very loving. She would buy a different type of cookie every week. And so my childhood has these sweet memories of different cookies, right? I also have this crazy memory of coming home to visit on leave, and I go to visit my grandmother who had had a stroke while I was away. And so now my grandmother is in a care facility, and I go in there to visit her. It was the last time I saw her. And I go in to visit her, and I have another guy with me, a friend of mine, and she mistakes us for my father and his friend before they're leaving for Vietnam. And so this is the early 90s, and the Gulf War is ended. I think we're just ending all that stuff. And so I'm home, and I walk in, and my grandmother thinks that I have just returned from Vietnam, or I'm leaving for Vietnam. And she warns us that, VD is out there and gonorrhea is ravaging, everyone. Personal note, as a teenager, Gen X lived through AIDS, right? So I just thought that was cute at the moment. I was like, gonorrhea? In my mind, AIDS was still fresh. And I was like, oh, okay, Granny, I love you. I go to give my grandmother a hug. She sidesteps me, plants a French kiss on the guy that was with me, who was just tagging along while I got to visit my grandma real quick. Okay. Boom! Smacks a French kiss right on my friend. And then she yells at my father, who is now apparently in the corner, and says, Al, you need to give everybody those cookies. I give my grandmother a hug. You know what I mean? It was a very emotional moment. She was a very strong woman. And I didn't know that was going to be the last time I saw her. But she apparently died while I was away, and my family told me 6 months later, which is a cute story. Out of sight, out of mind. My family has a lot of drama. A lot of things going on. So I came home and I was like, hey, I'm going to go see Grandma. Grandma has already left the building. Love her to death. Had a pet lion. I still cannot even. But everything I remember of the woman was that she was smart. She was intelligent. She was gorgeous. And she was strong. And nobody knew her story besides the fact that my family had this blissful recall, you know what I mean? My immediate family, me and my sister and stuff. And I don't even know if it was my sister so much. It just seemed like that's the story that was out there. Here's the funny thing as a kid. It's what you recollect, right? Your reality as a child is so weird. Itch my nose here. And if you've never done therapy, you need to step into the booth. You need to get into that office. You need to get in front of the video call. You need to get into it, because this is where therapy is powerful. You might find yourself in a moment in therapy where you get to travel back now as an adult into these childhood memories and start to re-examine them. Believe me, I've taken lots and lots of time doing this because it's the honorable thing to do for your mental health. It's the honorable thing to do. You can go in one direction and just have this leap of faith into your, insanity and, just believe every symptom and go down that rabbit hole. Or you can sit there and be intellectually honest with yourself and ask yourself, is this Memorex or is this real, right? I guess coming back from where I've come from, I've already lost my mind, so I already know that Memorex is a thing. And you might be asking yourself, what is this guy talking about? He's lost his mind. Okay, what is this guy talking about? Childhood trauma, isn't that what? No, it's not. It wasn't just that. You know what I mean? I had a violent childhood because my dad had a violent childhood, and I have all these weird things going on that we're going to talk about. There's heredity. I can already notice that there is something handed down. But here's the caveat for me, and this is why mental health is so important for me. Subconsciously, as you grow up, you put all these dams in place. You build all these walls. You put the structure up, and that structure, that foundation is what encompasses your mental health, right? It's that. That's your framework. Well, about 15, 16 years ago, 2008, I got rear-ended by a utility truck, and I suffered a traumatic brain injury. So all those foundational walls and rivets and dams and special access key moments and all that stuff, that all got destroyed. That version of me died. And so for 2.5 years, through seizures and all kinds of weird crap, I had to rebuild my brain. And moving forward from that traumatic brain injury, I've had to remap a ton of stuff. And so that's why it's pertinent. That's why it's relevant. Number one, I'm super lucky I was able to rebuild my brain and retain intellect. You know what I mean? Still be able to think and comprehend and be aware and be mindful. Number two, I was able to retrain certain parts of my brain that were reactionary, and they were not reactionary in a good way. So one of the blessings that came from a traumatic brain injury was the neural reconnections and to be able to deviate old habits away. So since the old me had died already through that traumatic brain injury, the new me got to come in, the new me that you witness now. I got to kind of tweak things a little bit on that recovery journey. And so that's why we talk about it. And that's why this is such an observational piece, right? Midlife virus is an observational piece because I've already been through the therapy. I'm still going in the therapy. I'm still searching and redirecting neural pathways, trying to create different reactions. Why? Hereditary mental health, regular compounded trauma, and a traumatic brain injury has a guy like me searching for answers and questions so I can regain some control, right? Control's where you want to be. You want to have a healthy state of mind. That's where you want to be. And since I've already experienced the worst part of my nightmares, I really don't want to go back to those places, right? That's the difference between my father, my grandfather, and me. It seems those two gentlemen had their anguish, but at the same time, they let go into bliss and the ignorance of being where they were. You know what I mean? Sometimes you can let insanity just take you with it, and that is so very dangerous. You know what I mean? There's two types of people in the world. Yeah, there's probably more, but let's just boil it down to two types of people in the world. You got people that react to pain through vengeance, and you have people that react to pain through forgiveness. And you have, I guess the third will be the people that find out that journey along the way, right? Yeah, I'm a little bit of both. I think I'm 80% forgiveness, 20% vengeance, whereas I think my father and my grandfather were more of the complete opposite. And you could tell those numbers, those parameters through their actions, right? Just through their actions, okay? So, Grandpa is whacking people with skillets and raping their girlfriend, per my father's story. I have no, collaborating. I've got no collaborating. I have no information that says that that's true. I've got no information that says all the violence in any of that stuff is true. I know that my father was housed with my great-grandmother in St. Louis. I know that she was a religious woman, and apparently they were generous and had a good reputation. I met her once when I was young, like 8, 6, 7, 8, and she was incredibly kind. I have no ill memories or anything. It was a beautiful trip to St. Louis. I get to meet all my family. You know what I mean? It's crazy because the story I'm growing up with, I don't know if that's the other story, because there's a nickname for my dad called Little Al, and it's not like the connotation is that little prick. No, it's Little Al. So I don't know, but we're going to talk about Little Al right now. So my dad's telling me these stories about my grandfather. It seems like they're corroborated. You know what I mean? He is in prison. He was firebombed. He did try to blow up a petroleum refinery or something. He gets caught red-handed with a bomb, everything. So you hear all these stories, and they're terrible stories. Who does that? Who knocks out their son with a skillet, rapes his date? Who, beats his kid with a garden hose, which I guess, per my father is like a thing. Who does that? Who has this levels of violence? Well, I'll tell you who. My dad, for some reason, thinks that this is the way you do it. Blows my mind to this day. Blows my mind to this day. So my dad's story goes like this. My dad was a Marine in Vietnam. And he he's forced to join the Marines because he was in a gang when he was a teenager and they hung a cop. Shocked the shit out of me, this story. So here's the thing. We talk about the stories that you tell your children and this narrative that you have as you're raising your children. I had an epiphany raising my kids, and we'll talk about that later. But there's this story, and it's not like you're an idiot. You're a child. You're growing up. You see society. You're watching Fraggle Rock. You know what I mean? You watch Sesame Street. You go to school. I was going to church. I was already introduced to Jesus, right? So you know there's these things. You're innocent, and I'm not out there trying to, burn the world. So you hear these stories, right? And so there's this story where he's in a gang. The gang, their name is the Vampires, which as a young boy, that was also frightening. What? You were in a gang of the undead? You wanted to mimic the undead? That's... What? You hung a cop. You did the what? So my dad's hanging cops. My grandfather is, trying to blow up oil refineries and murdering people and raping people. My grandmother's been turned into a prostitute with pet lions. Dad is here. And he tells me this story about how, for fun, and he would get bags of kittens and throw them in the St. Louis sewer and listen to them drown. And that was a thing of his. And number one, as a kid, you're like, well, where are you getting all these kittens? And that is terrible. As I get older, you find out that that's like psychopathic behavior, right? And we're gonna talk about my own psychopathic behavior. That's why I think some of this stuff is hereditary. That's what scares the shit out of me. That's why answers are important, right? Answers are important so you can have answers. So anybody down the line from me can say, hey, this is what notes look like. One of the best books out there written about schizophrenia is written by a schizophrenic. And I forgot his name, but I'm going to have to find his name and put it in the show notes. But that's how you discover the truth about things, is through these crazy-ass discussions and how people have these epiphanies, these epiphotic moments. I think I just made some more gibberish up, but you have these moments where you go, oh my God. Oh my God. Am I the product? Am I my father's sons, whatever? You know what I mean? So in the realm of mental health, super important to do this shadow work, to look through the eyes of the generational, visions and go, oh my God. So here my dad is, drowning kittens, hanging cops, and so they get caught. The vampires, they get caught. I can't remember how many people get caught, but I do remember that my dad tells me the judge says you need to go to Vietnam. That's, I guess, a thing. The draft is going on. Vietnam is going on. And so per my father, his story is that his sentence is Marine Corps boot camp, and he goes to the Marines and goes to Vietnam. And so that's one of these stories. And so my grandfather is violent. He's incredibly violent to my father and my father in his life. My grandfather has married prostitute after prostitute, sprinkling a couple of regular girls, right? My dad is hanging cops, killing kittens. It's not the only story. We move on through life, and my dad tells me these stories of how he's, shot guys in the back of the head behind bars in Mississippi. He's done this and done that and this and that. And, you're a young kid and you're believing these stories. Why? It's generational already. Your grandfather is in prison because of these things. You've met grandma, you know what I mean? You've heard the stories from mom and the family, right? Shotgun wedding, that's a story in my life. Shotgun wedding, that's a story. How is that a thing? You understand that, right? So here I am, blessed with some sort of IQ. I'm a kid asking myself, what the fuck is going on? I ask myself that a lot because you have friends and nobody has these stories. You're asking yourself, what the hell is going on? You start to get older and you realize that there's this rift between your family and everybody else. You start to realize that you come from a small town, right? You believe all these stories because there's violence in your life, right? My dad was violent. He did dumb shit. He was drunk. He was broken. He was fighting demons from Vietnam and his own mental health. And when you're a little kid standing in the way of that, guess what happens? You get burned. Right? So literally you get burned. So we have these things going on. And so my narrative as a child looks like second-class citizen of criminality, of mental health, of, just broken family. I don't even know half the details behind my mom yet. I don't know half the details behind my family yet. All I know is that I'm struggling with a couple of definitions. Yeah, my grandfather's a criminal. My dad is a criminal and hangs out with thuggish, fucked up criminal people. And here I am getting two stories. The story of this is what you do, and the story of don't you do this. It was incredibly confusing for me. It sucked because this is an abusive path. You're from it. You know you're not supposed to walk it. I'm supposed to be this. It was the most terribly confusing thing as a kid. Threw me through all kinds of vortexes and identity crisis. I went from one way to the other. I went from trying to be my dad, and that wasn't it, to not being my dad, and that wasn't it, to be in the beginning, from running away from it. Just it just never worked. And so that's a lesson you learn in sanity. It's your first lesson that you are not the shining knight when you can't even touch your fathers. You can't even heal him. You can't. Right? So I don't know how this Father's Day episode, this Father's Day series has just gone to a puddle of mush. But it's important to understand how these stories affect people moving forward. Midlife virus. I'm 49. I am still holding back tears as I tell this wacky narrative that I already understand. I had the craziest part in it. You know what I mean? Kids are brought into the world innocently. They don't choose their parents. From what we understand, we don't choose our parents. Now, that's up for debate in the ether of purgatory between lives and reincarnation. That's a whole thing. People can talk about that. But you don't choose your family, right? So I believe you come in as a clean slate somewhat. Heredity's a thing. I believe in that. Genetics is a thing. But you come in, you got this nature nurture thing, and then you got the story that people are giving you, the narrative, the agenda, this whole thing. That's why the slippery slope of parenting and all that is such a huge thing. People want to regulate it because of this. If there was parental regulation, which is crazy as fuck, but guys like my dad wouldn't be out there abusing the shit out of his family and tearing up people generationally, nor his father. If we could somehow figure out something, I don't know, I don't think that's ever going to happen because it's an overstep. And it also might take away the prerequisite of all the lessons. You know what I mean? I would not be the man I am today, nor understand the path that I'm on if I had not witnessed and taken this wacky-ass journey of criminality, prostitution, traumatic fucking bullshit, binge drinking, drug abuse. You know what I mean? All this shit was just a fucking wreck. I feel terrible for my mother. Terrible for my mother. I understand now with more insight than I've ever had why my grandparents and a lot of my in-laws and stuff looked at my dad and my family with disdain. You do not understand these definitions as a child. But now when you're older and you've raised your kids and you're a father, you know what I mean? Now you understand. You know, it's come to my attention in the last couple of years that my dad had dozens of DUIs. Dozens of DUIs. And if you get caught once, that means you've got away with it hundreds and hundreds of times. So if this guy had dozens of DUIs, then it's a safe assumption that he most likely was drunk all the damn time, right? I've got stories of my dad taking me to the bar because back in the 70s and the 80s, Gen X children We're a special breed. Gen X children got to go into bars with their parents. Gen X children were allowed to go up, 8-year-old little kid, go up and get the pitcher of beer and bring it back. No questions asked. Gen X children could just go buy the cigarettes and bring them back. So Gen X children was like an accessory, during those ages. If you had a kid with you, you had a mini butler. And so my father brought me around to all the bars that he was at. He brought me around to all the drug dens and all the biker dens. He loved bikers, not the nice kind that we have today. He loved seedy, sweaty, nasty, drunk, drug-doing, topless, skinny, broad bikers. He just loved those people. It was terrible to be a young boy of my mindset, growing up around all this crap, watching huge tables of pills while hairy, weird, skeezy-looking dudes talk about them and, divide them up. There's always a huge book that is the encyclopedia of pharmaceuticals, right? That's always in every apartment. Just nasty. And he doesn't even get it, right? That's the thing. Dude doesn't even get it. Leaving a kid in a car in an alleyway for hours and hours and hours while you're inside doing whatever you're doing, and weird-ass bikers are coming out in the alleyway and bending over biker chicks. You know what I mean? It's just, what the hell's going on back in the 70s and 80s? Just a weird time. It happens today. I'm not saying that boomers are the only parents that do it. Gen X parents are breaking contracts. Millennial parents are breaking contracts. Gen Z parents are going to be breaking contracts. Contracts get broken every day because there's lots of parents that have kids that don't even want to honor contracts. That's why you've got guys like me all brokenhearted. There's a little tiny boy inside of me that's holding on to a broken piece of crap contract. Which I'm going to tell you the secret. The secret is you realize that the other dude didn't want to sign the contract in the beginning. That's the secret. That's one of the revelations that I've come up to in the last 20 years is, I was so angry at my father. So angry at that man. You were such a crappy father. And then one day I realized, you just signed the deal for the crappy car so you could get the crappy car. You weren't really going to pay for it. You know what I mean? You were going to default. And why? Because you were taught how to default. You know what I mean? And apparently you didn't want to generational crap like that happens, right? You can see people do that. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree kind shit. You know what I mean? I cannot speak for my father because when I watched his anguish, his definition of his anguish didn't sound like I feel terrible for all the shit I've done. His definition of anguish was always, why did it happen to me? So as a young boy, I would watch my dad get just batshit drunk and he would scream at God, which is a terrible thing for a child to witness. Just FYI, terrible. I believe in God. So, did you see the sardonic laughter? My dad's drunk screaming at God. And not like Forrest Gump, the legless friend in the ship. Not like that, Just screaming at him. So angry. Why me? Why me is an observational note I'd like to bring up right now. Why me is a framework. It's a viewpoint. It's a victim viewpoint. We might even step into psychotic narcissism when we're talking about my dad, right? So we've got this guy screaming at the universe, why? But on the other hand, he's out there dishing it out. So I always saw that as, how dare you scream at a universe while your shorts are down and you're pissing all over it. You know what I mean? It never made any sense to me. His street. I don't know how that worked out for him because I don't view the universe like that. I view the universe like this. What you give it, it gives back to you. So if you disrespect the universe by being a dick, guess what the universe is going to do to you? It's going to resist you. You're resisting it. It's going to resist you. My question to my father so often was why? Yeah. I imagine there were some people that witnessed that. He'd be choking me, doing some fucked up shit, and I would ask him, why are you doing this? Sardonic laughter. He never had an answer. I don't even know if he ever comprehended what I was doing, but the narrative of violence, of criminality, of lawlessness, prostitution, second-class citizenry, drugs. You know what I mean? It was just scheme after scheme after scheme. I witnessed way too much of it. You know what I mean? Here's something. Who's got a story where their dad robs the bank with his dick? I've got that story. Yeah, I've got that story. My dad had a sidekick. That was me. And he would drive all over the place, all to these little-ass towns, visiting his weird biker friends, doing stupid shit. Well, we're in this little town in the middle of nowhere, and he says, hey, come with me. We go into a bank. He's got bank business to do, apparently. I'm young. I'm knee-high to a grasshopper. My head is waist-high. And my dad puts his dick on the counter. The fuck? Next thing you know, we're leaving. He's zipping up his pants, and we're driving away. I'm in shock. Remember, it's not like I have this relationship with my dad. Hey, man, what are you doing? Fuck, that movie was badass. Fuck that. No, I was one of those kids that was seen and not heard and shit. I don't ever remember the guy saying he loved me. It was one of those relationships. I think he cared for me, but I can't remember that. So we're in the car. He stops by a 7-Eleven. We go into the 7-Eleven. There's a commotion. We come out. He's got a handful of shit. Throws me a bunch of snowballs. Here you go. Later on, I hear him talking to his friend about how he put his dick on the counter and robbed a bank and such and fuck. And you're like, what the fuck? Now, here's the thing. Perceptually, you're a kid. You cannot tell. Is this the truth? We had a farmhand die, right? It was violent. They said his dog mauled him. My dad insists that he took care of it. But you're a kid. And so you don't know. All you know is your dad's kicking your ass. He's habitually kicking mom's ass. All his friends are a bunch of douchebags. Grandpa's a douchebag. So you believe the douchebag, right? So here's the thing that we do that's wrong. Number one, that story sucks. If half that shit is false, that's fucked up. Don't do that to children. Don't fucking do that. That's one of the societal problems that we have, is we got this weird-ass blissful recall where we talk about criminality like it's some cool-ass shit. Like, I don't ever remember anybody in my childhood saying this was wrong. It seemed like it was being built up. Grandpa was this is that, I survived this, I did that. There were all these calling cards and these trophies, but what they don't understand is that the trophies that you're talking about, I don't even understand why this is a trophy, Dad. You hung a cop. What? You know what I mean? And that's just one of the stories. I had an epiphany. My oldest daughter is 8 years old. And for the first 8 years of her life, I made the exact same mistake. As a young father, I was displaying these trophies. Your great-grandfather died in prison. And look at this, your great-grandmothers, both of them, they were prostitutes. And one had a lion, right? And I had all these stories. And then your grandfather grabbed my hand and he held it to the hot barrel and I burnt the shit out of my hand. And, you had all these stories. And then one day, I watched my beautiful daughter, her vibration started to change. Do you know what I mean? She started to vibrate like my family. And that's not what I wanted to recreate. And it hit me like a bolt of fucking lightning. And I immediately stopped. All the amazing stories of criminality and fucking debauchery, and we survived all this shit, because that's what they are. They're trophies of survival, but it's the most macabre fucking display if you think about it. Trophies of survival need to look a lot more like my wife and their family. You know what I mean? Butchers, field workers, generational poverty that finds its way out of the ghetto, unity, family, devotion. Those are trophies you display. And so I'd like to warn everybody that's out there, if you have realized this or not, what trophies you display are just super important to the story your children will tell. And so I have this epiphany and I stop it. And there is a dramatic difference between my oldest daughter and my other youngest kids, which there's 3 other kids past my oldest daughter. I did not talk about my dark family history like I was. I beat that habit. I stopped that sharing that verbal heritage, because it was a thing before. You know, Dad had 155 stories. My wife and my kids would mock and joke, oh, you get 155 stories, you know, so colorful and all this. And everybody's like, oh my God. But then you snap out of it and you realize that you're perpetuating a verbal curse. We can find strength in my grandmothers, right? We can find strength in my grandmothers because they were sex trafficked and they were brought into the fold by men. Do you know what I mean? And I saw the strength in my grandmother, you know, as long as I knew her. We can find strength in my father and my grandfather's story. There's strength in it. There's also weakness, and there's a lot of pain. But here we go, walking towards Father's Day. And walking towards Father's Day, you might be asking yourself right now, man, you are putting the biggest bullshit vibe on Father's Day. Well, guess what? It gets better. My dad, love him to death. Everything I am today, through his mistakes, I am a greater man. But that guy, as he was walking towards death, he didn't want to listen to anybody, right? So he was an alcoholic, drug abuser, did all kinds of drugs. He was running, clearly he was running from his pain. He also had mental health issues. He had PTSD to the utmost degree. He also had a slight frontal lobotomy when he was a child. He was hit by a car and suffered a brain injury to which they had to remove a piece of his brain. So my dad, I do harbor, grace and humility, and I do see his life for what it is. I do not say, you are a demon unto this planet. No, I see my dad for what he is, and I also witnessed his anguish, and I was there with him unto the day that he died, which happened to be Father's Day. My dad died on Father's Day, and so you might be asking yourself, I was wondering why he's got such a depressing story leading up to Father's Day. Well, when we get to about this time every year and it gets close to Father's Day, my mind cannot escape the thoughts of the fathers in my life that came before me and what I am today as a father. And so this Father's Day series is all about that. It's about my grandfather, my father, me as a father. How do you pick up those pieces and that legacy without, number one, you cannot destroy it. I don't believe in rewriting history that way. I believe in letting ugly history remain. You just have to find a really eloquent, tactful, and diplomatic way to share ugly history, right? My family needs to know what we are and where we come from, not because of the blissful recall and these shitty trophies. No, it's so you can recognize it if it rears its head again in generations coming forth. If my grandson talks like my father and my grandfather, you know what I mean? I want everybody to know what that looks like. Do you know what I mean? I don't need some graphic novel that explains every nasty moment of my family's history, but there has to be, just like, you know, alcoholism, heart issues, cancer, whatever. Your mental health and your family health history is super important. And if you got a couple of guys that are like my dad and like my grandfather, that are like me, I noticed my father and my grandfather's traits within me. That's why I question my mental health every time I turn around, right? I'm not blissfully going to lean into it. No fucking way. So, unlike my dad and unlike my grandfather, I am taking notes. This right here is the biggest attempt, is this video diary, this podcast, me talking about this stuff. I have not talked about this with anybody outside of my family. My wife, my kids, my mom, my sister, my brother-in-law. You know what I mean? Nobody knows this story, but you might recognize this story in yourself. The blissful recall of chaos, and how does my family think it's legit? I get it. On one hand, you want to normalize it. I get it. But on the other hand, you cannot normalize it the way that my family went about it. My dad went about telling me every raunchy, nasty, criminal detail of everything he did. Took me along to see his weird-ass criminal friends. And if they weren't weird criminal friends, they were just whacked-out PTSD veterans. And all they did was drugs and drink and talk about Vietnam. You know what I mean? You really need to pay attention to what your kids see as you raise your kids, right? Because it's going to come forth like me. You know, I'm sure my family is like, holy shit, that guy came away with a different filter than the rest of us. Yes, because I was seeing different stuff. My dad did not bring my sister along, and my mom sure as fuck wasn't there. I don't remember seeing my uncle, my aunties, or my grandparents there. No, my dad was off doing his debauchery and his weird-ass shit with his weird-ass friends. And me, because it was the 70s and the 80s and Gen X kids were accessories, you just find yourself there. I wish I wasn't there. I wish I didn't see all that stuff. I've got all kinds of weird fucking mental maps because of it, right? I am totally against public displays of affection other than like hugging and kissing. Why? Because weird-ass, drugged-up bikers were having sex everywhere, and it was nasty, right? And you're not supposed to be seeing that as a kid. So I've got all kinds of personal issues about it. Keep it off the TikTok, please, because I'm triggered. Anyway, hey, the family dynamic and the agenda, the story, the definitions that we perpetuate mean something. My dad had an opportunity to talk about the rocket scientist that is in the family. He had an opportunity to talk about the artist that was in the family, the guy who did stained glass art and worked on churches. You know, there's all these guys, engineers, artists, writers, you know, in my family's lineage. It's not criminals left and right and prostitutes. You know what I mean? It's not eccentric, crazy people. You know what I mean? It's a whole badass history of people. And so that story was neglected. And so that's an observational point that you need to realize as a parent. Wait a minute. The story you tell is a very wide story. The family tree is a very large tree. When you only speak of one branch, that can be incredibly detrimental. In my case, it was incredibly detrimental, right? My definition of what I was as a young man was defined by these stories. Your father hung a cop. Your grandpa's in prison. Your grandmothers are prostitutes. All these deals in the parking lot, shotguns here, drugs there. And then I'm getting yelled at left and right for being the shittiest kid in the world. And so how can I be even worse than what my family has already been defined as? And so there has been the mind fuckery that I've discovered. And that's why you go to therapy, and that's why cognitive therapy works. That's why you go back in time and you realize that all this violence, all this chaos, all these fucked up definitions that you were just a child trying to define. And now, after you've been a man, I've been a man, by the way. I've done all these things that, you know, my father would have never been able to do. For example, I stop the fucked up violence that my dad, you know what I mean? I cannot tell you the dozens of times I've stepped in between some abusive fuck and his wife and kids. You know, I wish there would have been dudes like that in my life. I didn't see any of them, right? And so I'm not judgy. I know what it is. I know it's hard. But, you know, I stood up when my father and my grandfather failed to stand for the right thing. So to be that is something that we all need to do. If you can be the prototype that breaks generational curses, it's something that I invite you to do. And so we are now, what a jumble of traumatic, weird-ass pancakes that's a breakfast meal for all of us. We just walked down to the buffet of pain. My father died on Father's Day. So as we walk towards Father's Day, I'm going to talk a lot about what it is to be a father, what it is to have to rewrite the definitions of a father. My dad died when I was 22. My wife's father died when she was 19. So we don't have any grandfathers. And so that's a whole nother definition. How do you raise kids when there's no grandpa backup? How do you raise kids when there's no other fathers around, right? And so that's a whole nother discussion. How do you back up the contracts? What this looks like? How do your boys see the hearts of men? You know what I mean? We have all these things that fathers need to discuss. And when you're a guy like me, it was a blank slate because I had to redefine these fucked up definitions that was on the agenda. You know what I mean? All these blissful recalls of criminality and these weird ass trophies. You know what I mean? I'll tell you why we're discussing it. Why we're defining my childhood is because it was a waste of fucking time. You know what I mean? Just the display, all that shit. The only thing it gave me was experience, and I know how to speak the language. And I guess there's a journey in that. Damn it. This is me being selfish and tired. Sometimes the journey is fucking redundant and rough, right? Sometimes you just want a vacation. And when you've got mental health, it just doesn't happen, right? You got to learn to take it and figure it out. But anyway, we are going to discuss that. This is the Fatherhood Special, the Father's Day series, part 1. Defining that story and how important that story is, and just telling my story so you can understand, this is why this guy has this whole justice scenario and why it was important for him to define what it is to be a father, why it was important to say, I love you to my children 8 billion times. And so, hey, stay tuned for this fatherhood series, what it is to be a father, part 2. It will be coming soon, within days, probably next week. There are new episodes every Friday, so just FYI, new content dropping every Friday. And if you're lucky, if I'm lucky, we got new content rolling in, you know, with a surprise. Hey, new content today. Anyway, thank you for joining me. And here is a word from our sponsors. This is your host, Sean Harflinger, and this is Midlife Virus sponsorship coming now. And now a word from our sponsors. Funky Puppy Productions. If you need a production done, Funky Puppy Productions can do it for you. Visit us at funkypuppyproductions.com. Caring for mothers. MalamaYourMama.com. Malama Your Mama is an organization that is all about caring for mothers. To Malama is to care. And one of the greatest gifts that we can give our mothers and new mothers is that support system that they so desperately need. Together, we can teach the world to Malama our mamas, just like our mamas have Malama'd us. We want to dedicate this organization and its proceeds to all the strong mothers out there that have honored us. We want to steward healthy mothers and to raise mothers up. Together, we can malama our mamas. Caring for mothers. Help us by visiting malamayourmama.com and supporting our cause. Mahalo. Side Fecta. Sometimes you just need to spank that spark together. It's been a long time, hasn't it? But you two still want to hook up like you used to. Side Fecta is made for humans, and humans are made to share their spark. Share your spark like you used to back in the good old days, remember? Yeah, you do. Let her remember, just like you used to. Side Fecta. Spank that spark together. Side Fecta. Side Fecta has side effects. Uncommon but not related to. In the case of the following side effects, call 911. Blurred vision, swollen tongue, hives, hot flashes, cool flashes, rash, erection lasting longer than 8 days, hypererotic urges, shortness of breath, gotta smack that ass, fever, chills, and possibly death. Side Fecta.
We've got the gear for whatever realm you decide to reside. InterdimensionalOutfitters.com.
There's gonna be days it feels like you got smacked in the face with an iron skillet. You can do it, and you can will it. Those better days are coming, so next time they come swinging with that iron skillet, duck.
Once again, this is your host, Sean Harflinger, and I want to say thank you for watching and listening to Midlife Virus. Like us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook. We're also on Instagram. You can find us on Instagram. If you are so inclined, I want you to come find us on YouTube. You can find us on YouTube at My Midlife Virus. And moving forward, please join us next week for part 2 of our Father's Day series, What It Is to Be a Father. All I know is that I know nothing at all. And it's because of this mantra I've been honest. I don't have all the answers. I can only seek the answers. And hopefully, together, we can find these answers. Because after all, we don't know anything at all. You know, I tried to sound super sexy saying that. And I sounded like a complete idiot. Here's the truth. I'm just trying to find answers because I'm getting sick of being lost. And so here we are. We're going to work on this together. Join me as I join myself here at Midlife Virus.